Happy beginning of week 13, everybody. I tell you what, it's week 13, which I know that's an unlucky number, but what a great time. I'll just let you finish your conversation. I understand. What I say is sus at best, you know. So everybody gets a kick out of saying this. You're too old to say that, Dr. Barnes. It's like I really am. I really honestly am. So we're actually doing our final lecture today. I'm not sure this is going to be the final time we're in this classroom. I'm still trying to decide on whether we're going to do the presentations in the other classroom or this classroom. Now, I know everybody would like to be in the other classroom, but my problem with that is that during the presentation, there's a big obstruction in the way of most people during presentations. And while you're in the other classroom, you're going to be taking notes because of part of the assignment, and so people are just going to be focused on their computers, and it's just going to be really, really awkward because when you're up there and you're presenting and you can't see anybody's faces, like, you know, it's really distracting when you're a presenter. So that's why I'm leaning towards doing it in here. I have not decided yet. It's a little bit easier to take notes in the other room, but it's also very distracting for presenters in that room. So I'll make a decision. We'll talk about that over break. I actually will. I'm going to work on something. I'll have some presentation tips for everybody throughout presenting the groups. So just so everyone knows, we got all the topics done. So I am very proud of this class. This is my lowest level class. This is the junior level class, and everybody in this group selected their topics and their presentation dates before all of my other classes, despite the fact that all the other classes have fewer people in them. So I actually get to give grief to my graduate students because they selected last, you know, which usually I'm expecting my graduate students to be on the ball, and they were falling behind. So if you see one of the accounting graduate students, you say, yeah, Dr. Barnes is talking trash about you. And I absolutely am talking trash about them. Yeah. So so here we go. We got some topics, some really, really fun topics. I think we got some AI topics and some cybersecurity topics. I think these will be good presentations. I'll talk a little bit more about those next week, probably closer to the exam, just my expectations of that. I will try not to take up too much time, especially today, since we've got stuff to talk about. I may talk a little bit about it on Wednesday, because I think Wednesday is going to be a shorter class since we're just going over homework. But yeah, with that, a couple other things. You will notice that down here we have Exam 2 Study Guide, Practice Exam, and you can't access it yet, but Practice Exam 2 key. I met my promise. It was hard. I was working till 10 p.m. last night. But I got let's see. I actually can't see when it was uploaded. But yeah, I was working until 10 p.m. last night, but I got the practice exam done. I made my promise. Okay. I want that going in my evaluations. Dr. Barnes is a man of his word. All right. So practice exam. After today, you should have all the knowledge you need to go through everything in the practice exam. We do have homework on Wednesday, which is another reminder because we're doing a quick turnaround. But all the topics, all of the topic areas we're going to be discussing should be covered for the exam after we have our topic discussion today. Today, I think is got some down points, but it's a fun one overall. As far as the preparation goes, please remember that we have the exam review when we come back from Thanksgiving break. So the reason I did this so early, the reason I got this out to you 2.5 weeks before the exam is going to take place, is to let you guys work on this before Thanksgiving break, because I'm assuming most of you do not want to work during Thanksgiving break. If you do, more power to you. You don't have to work this week. But I got this out so you could actually start doing the preparation ahead of time, and then you can just come in next Monday having already, or not next Monday, the week after Monday, having already completed it. So yeah, if I put my best foot forward, so I would like you guys to keep pace on that. And so I'm doing what I can to try to make things a little bit easier for you all. I know it's a bummer having an exam right after break. Again, that's not intentional, just the way that the schedule worked out. But yeah, that's what I did for that. I already mentioned it. I've got homework that's going to be due on Wednesday, our last homework assignment. Then when we come back from break, we have professional interaction due that Monday. That'll be the exam review and the exam on Wednesday. And then I've already talked about the group presentations. Please don't wait until the day before, the class period before presentations, to reach out to your group. Start thinking about who's going to be responsible for what areas of the assignment now. I know that's a lot. It seems like a long ways away. It's like 3 weeks away from the presentations. But if you wait till like the Friday before presentations, you will not give an optimal presentation. And I think everybody in this course is capable of giving a good presentation, not just something that you hash up at the last minute and the slides look disaggregated and looks like one person prepared these slides, another person prepared these slides, another person kind of prepared these slides, but they did a roughshod job. I would like this to be a professional presentation for everybody involved. So please keep that in mind. Yes.
Just say we have to take notes on other people. Like, what's that look like?
Yeah, so I'll explain that. Basically, the reason for that, and I'll go into more detail. When we do final exams, the people taking the final exam will have questions about the presentation. The people not taking final exams will not have to obviously will not have to take an exam, so they won't have to know anything about the presentation. Which when that happens, whenever people are in that situation, they tend to say, "Oh, I'm done. I don't have to pay any attention to what people are saying," which is really, really disrespectful. So that's kind of my way to ensure that you're paying attention to what people are saying. It is not meant to be an onerous task. I'm not going to say you have to write a paper on every single one. Usually 1 or 2 paragraphs will suffice. The idea being is I want everybody engaged when we're presenting, because I'm used to when people are kind of halfway paying attention to what I do. That's what I do for a living. It really sucks when you're a student and your peers are not listening to what you're saying. It's really, really unfortunate. So that's why I do that. I'll talk more about the context for that and what the expectations are, but that's just for the people who are not taking the final exam. If you're taking the final exam, you'll want to take notes anyway, because I'm going to ask questions about the presentations. So, all right, today, like I said, our final chapter in the course. Chapter 14, information security and computer fraud. Information security and computer fraud. Some of the stuff is really interesting. I find that there are certain topics that students tend to grasp onto and say, this is really cool. Obviously, we're going to talk a little bit about cybersecurity. I'm going to cover very, very high level topics of cybersecurity because many of you, 3 of the groups in this course are doing cybersecurity topics for their presentation. So we're not going to go into depth on that. Suffice to say, it is a fascinating area and one that's increasing prominence. For those of you who are planning on going to graduate school here in the accounting program at Truman State, we talk a lot about that in the advanced AIS course. So that's something to consider as well. So let's go ahead and talk about the basic concepts of information security. You will see the term InfoSec used as a certain for information security. I will use that occasionally. I will say that InfoSec seems like a needless shortening, but that's what it's called. But basically, information security management is identified as a key technology issue in business accounting. So this is one of those areas that you're going to encounter a lot in your careers. And it honestly does not matter where you go for your career. Unless you decide to join the Peace Corps and you go to a country where there's honestly no technology, there's going to be very, very low chance that you will not encounter information technology concerns in these areas. So what are some things that you need to consider? What are some things that you will need to know with respect to information technology security concerns? Well, we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about the different categories of those. But the high level concern is this idea of system integrity. And what does system integrity mean? The idea being is that users should be able to perform functions of a system without being degraded or impaired by unauthorized manipulation. If those characteristics exist, then the system is said to have integrity. Now, I'm going to refer to this incident back a lot because we actually have a practical incident that most everybody in this room should know about. We lost system integrity back in April of 2023. And so that's actually an example that we can use as a tangible lesson for what InfoSec is supposed to encapsulate. So remember when you had no email access and your professors were doing presentations, but they didn't have their slides. So they basically had to hand out slides. So they had to write on the board. I didn't write on the board. My handwriting is atrocious, but I did hand out slides so that my students could access. You had no Blackboard access. It was very, very challenging. And that was an example of a failure, system availability failure. The system integrity failure, excuse me. So we're going to go into a little bit of depth about what the aspects of system or information security are. There's a lot of different aspects to this. Again, information security is paramount, but there's also the concerns about fraud. We're also going to talk about system availability at a very high level. So one of the things that we need to discuss is we need to discuss what are the key components of this idea of information security. Well, according to the ACCT, the primary focus of information security is the balanced protection of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. And you'll notice that I put a big triangle up here, okay? This is called the CIA triad, which I realize that if you use that term, it sounds like a mix between a government agency and a crime syndicate, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a triangle that represents the aspects of this idea of what are the key primary factors with respect to information security. Now, if you thought you needed more triangles in your accounting career, I have not one, but 2 different triangles in this presentation, okay? So I'm incorporating some geometry just for you guys. Actually, it was just kind of happy circumstance that these are both in here, but this is the first of our triangles, the CIA triad. First of these is confidentiality, and this is probably the most paramount given privacy concerns that are related to information, not just in an organization, but personally as well. I think one of the groups is doing presentation on data breaches, and data breaches talks about this violation of confidentiality that occurs when companies do not safeguard stakeholder information. But information should not be accessible to unauthorized individuals or processes. Now, at a fundamental level, we've already talked about this. We've already talked about segregation of duties within different areas, particularly when we talk about computerized systems. Remember, we spent 7 different class periods talking about NetSuite, and I said, hey, we can access everything because we're the administrators. But if we were doing this in the real world, one person would do one task, one person would do another task. That will be one aspect of confidentiality we're concerned about, is that privacy that occurs, or that segregation responsibilities that occurs between different functions within the organization. Some individuals should not have access to information, and other individuals should have access to that information. But we can think about it from a broader perspective. We don't want organizational information falling into the hands of individuals who should not have this information. And certainly we don't want stakeholder information. When I say stakeholder, keep in mind, this is anybody associated with the organization that has a vested interest. So this can include customer information. And you can actually see a rich history of this. You can go back. There was the TJX company back in the mid-2000s had a massive data breach, then Target in 2013, Home Depot in 2014, and it just goes on and on. So access to the information is really, really important. We want to make sure that's not restricted. Then we have integrity of information. Obviously, integrity is really important because we want to make sure the information we have is complete and it's accurate. So integrity of information is probably less prominent in confidentiality, but still really, really important. Organizations cannot make decisions properly if they don't have information that is accurate and complete. So this is going to be one of those aspects that's again a little less prominent. It's going to play less of a role in the information security incidents we're going to talk about, but still very critical within the context of this information security management. Then finally, we have availability, and availability is one we've already talked about. Information systems are accessible on demand. Now, at a very basic level, this can be related to the technology itself. I struggle with this, and I kind of shared my woes in this class. Sometimes I go into log on my computer, and it takes like 2 minutes for the login to process, and I click on a link, and it takes like 30 seconds to link it open. Is that availability violation? Yes, but is that what I'm talking about? Not really. Okay, it is available. It's just not going as fast as I'd like. Which that is saying something right now. As a 51-year-old man, I'm going faster than a computer. All right, so that's that is definitely a concern. But availability in this context is basically making sure that the systems themselves are available perpetually. Not perpetually, but consistently. That's a good word. Consistently. And again, this goes back to the example of the ransomware attack that Truman State had. That would be an example of availability violation. Ransomware itself is a violation of this availability aspect of the CIA triad. So 3 very important components, and something to keep in mind with respect to information security. If all of these are retained, then we can say an information secure and it allows for access upon demand. If one of these aspects is not present, then there's a problem with the information security management of a particular system. All right, moving a little bit more, we've probably heard this term of cybersecurity. Like I said, I would love to spend more time on cybersecurity because it's a fascinating area. And it's one of those areas that's so broad that probably can't actually cover everything that's necessary. I am going to talk about a few different incidents, a few different things that you should be familiar with, simply because not just because I might test them on the exam, but because there's things that you would encounter in the real world as well. So modernized computer information systems face a diverse array of threats, which I said is cyber attacks, but they're not limited to this list. So here's a list of a lot of them. Now, just so you know, I'm not going to ask you to spew out a list on these. I'm going to talk about a few that I think are very important. All of these are relevant threats that have occurred over the past few decades, and we might encounter them to varying degrees. You've probably heard about several of these more frequently than others. So the ones that are on this list that you're probably familiar with, social engineering. Social engineering is an example of trying to actually gain information where you're not allowed to have, or information you're not allowed to have. This was really prominent back in the 1980s and 90s when computer systems were first being developed, and they were very mildly protected, and they didn't have use of dynamic passwords. So people would write their passwords on Post-it notes. I mean, some people still do that, which is not a good idea. They write their passwords on Post-it notes and put it in their cubicles. So somebody enters the office and just walks around and see, oh, okay, password is chicken1. All right, so I didn't make that password up. That was actually a password of a recent cyber attack. So yeah, they write it down and they basically can access the system because somebody left their password out in the open. Other ones are going to be a little bit more subtle. Has anybody ever seen those Facebook quizzes where they ask you information that seems kind of random, but they say, oh, what street did you grow up on? What was your mother's maiden name? And you have to answer these questions like, oh, this is a fun quiz. Don't take those quizzes. That's a bad idea. They're trying to mine for information so they can get information in detail on your accounts and they can actually access that. Because oftentimes those are questions that are used to verify identity information. Data breaches have become increasingly commonplace. I talked about those. This is where access to organizational information to access a larger set of data. Oftentimes we talk about credit card data breaches. So that was an example of the TJX hack, the Target hack, and the Home Depot hack. Do you have a question, Joe?
Oh yeah, I was gonna say like social engineering is kind of becoming like bigger recently since the actual like services are getting so good that like the weakest point is people.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, is that the weakest point in any system often is not the technology of the people who utilize that system, particularly if you get older individuals. And I'm not trying to disparage old people because I am one of those. But if you get individuals who used to use older systems that are familiar with that particular level of security, and they're insisted upon to actually follow new protocols, it's often difficult for them to actually adapt to those new protocols. Yes, Marley.
What was the name of the second type you talked about? I got distracted by you
Sure.
talking. I'm
Sure.
so interested in that.
So fascinating, yeah.
Yeah.
So social engineering, then data breaches.
All right, thank you.
And then, of course, something that everybody in this room is familiar with is ransomware. That was the attack that occurred at Truman State back in April. That's basically where individuals get unauthorized access to the account, and they basically shut it down so nobody can access it. They say, pay us money or you will never get these files again. We're going to talk about some ways to avoid the ransomware attacks, and good on Truman State because they actually had these protocols in place. I know it was really inconvenient at the time, but I will say the ITS did a fantastic job, even though it didn't seem like at the time because we were down for like 2 weeks. They did a fantastic job in recovery with what resources they had. Some other ones that are not on this list, but you may be familiar with, and I just wanted to mention these because this, like I said, this is not a comprehensive list. Phishing. This probably occurs to you fairly regularly. This is one thing that happens on the Truman State Network. I will say the new email client is much better about eliminating phishing emails, but basically this is just trying to gain information through emails, trying to encourage people to access or to click on links that provide access. I will unhappily admit that I was a victim of a phishing scam the very first time I came to Truman State because I didn't realize it was so prevalent. And so I did that exact thing. I clicked on a link and said, oh, I'm logging into Blackboard, even though it was not a legit Blackboard link. It was a spoof Blackboard site. They shut down my account so quickly. I said, yeah, you tried to click on an external link that was not valid. It's like, no, I didn't. Oh, yes, I did. Yes, I did. Then we have something that's kind of interesting. It's called cryptojacking, which this is something that's apparently a bigger threat that's become very common recently. This is where individuals access computerized systems for the purpose of cryptocurrency mining. So they utilize the resources in play on your system. I don't think my computer's been cryptojacked, but it would explain why it runs really slowly. And then another one is Internet of Things attacks. So have you guys heard the term Internet of Things? Basically, all that means is that devices other than computers now use the internet. It seems kind of cool. It's like, oh, my refrigerator uses the internet, my thermostat uses the internet, my car uses the internet. That's really cool, but it also leaves us susceptible to cybersecurity threats. And so people can actually access this and they can do nefarious things to it. There's a John Oliver episode. I love watching it Last Week Tonight, even though it's a little bit blunt and abrasive. He had a really good episode on ransomware, and he talked about how ransomware attacks were occurring on people's thermostats. They were jacking the temperature up in people's houses to like 95 degrees and saying, pay us money or you're never going to be able to adjust your thermostat downward. So if that's the case, I'd probably be getting my summer clothes and I'd say, all right, just get ready for a warm time in the house. Actually, I couldn't say that because I despise high temperature, so I wouldn't be able to handle it. I would not be able to handle it. One thing that's not on this list, and it's not really a threat, but it's something to be relevantly aware about, is there is currently a massive shortage of cybersecurity professionals. Back in 2021, the CEO of IBM, whose name I don't recall, but he actually mentioned that in the cybersecurity realm, they're short about 500,000 jobs in the United States. So they've got positions that are open across the United States for cybersecurity professionals. on the degree of order about 500,000 individuals. So this is an area that's definitely got a lot of opportunity there. If this is something that personally interests you, I would encourage you to pursue it, because this is not only a burgeoning area that's going to require people who are very knowledgeable and very capable in this area, but it's actually a very good career path as well. So something to consider. I also, there was something else I was going to mention. So there's certain industries that are very susceptible to cyber attacks that are kind of vulnerable right now. The least of which, or probably the most commonplace of which is going to be healthcare industry. Healthcare industry is currently very much in shortage of cybersecurity professional, and they're very vulnerable to cyber attacks. Just think about if you're at the hospital and you're about to have a very major surgery, and all of a sudden all the records get shut down because of a ransomware attack. You're probably not in a good situation if you're a patient there, which is very, very serious and very concerning as well. All right. So what are some ways that we can maintain information security? Well, there are going to be two types. The first of which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail in just a second is encryption. This is just encoding plaintext information into a non-readable form or ciphertext for the purpose of data transmission and storage. You've probably heard this term before, but we're going to go in a little bit more depth about what this represents. The other one I know you've heard of before. This is authentication. So authentication is the process of establishing the origin or information or information or determining the identity of a user, process, or device. So some very basic forms of authentication that you already know about is going to be user IDs and passwords. These are the ones that are kind of baseline authentication mechanisms for any computerized system. But you probably also heard of the term multi-factor authentication. In fact, I know you have, because I've said it in this course before. But multi-factor authentication is kind of like that new Duo app that you have to use to sign into Outlook. That's an example of a code that's transmitted by an external device. That can be email, that can be text message, that can actually be phone call for accessibility purposes. Or some other ones. So back in the day, if we go back like 10, 15 years ago, people actually had tokens for VPN access that actually had a randomly generated number that you would utilize to enter a code so you can access an information system. Biometrics is becoming increasingly common. That's like your fingerprint. Like I have, whenever I sign into my iPad, for example, I have to put my thumb over the button so that it actually recognizes my my identity. Of course, I can also type in a numeric code, so that seems like a little bit of a workaround. Facial recognition, that's my other iPhone device, actually has facial recognition. And then identity questions, we already experienced those in NetSuite. Those are something that we would actually be that used to be used relevant with relevant passwords. If we forgot our passwords, use an identity question as a backup. Now they're often frequently paired with passwords, as the case with NetSuite. And then geographic location is an example of a multi-factor authentication, saying, all right, I currently see your location is in Russia. Are you currently in Russia? It says, no, Kirksville is not in Russia. So there's a problem there. So that would be something that we would look at for that particular context. All right, let's talk about encryption. So I do want to apologize, by the way. Some of the screenshots I took were directly from the book, and I have noticed an abundance of grammatical errors in some of these items. So if it looks at something that's like, wow, Dr. Barnes really dropped the ball on the grammar, I'm going to say that, yeah, I probably more dropped the ball because I took something from an external source, and then that external source had those grammatical errors. But we're going to see a couple of those. So this is kind of some factors of encryption. So the key length, you've probably heard of an encryption key. An encryption key, the longer the key length is, the more complex the encryption is. And so at the baseline right now, 128-bit encryption, which is, you know, as it sounds, 128 bits, it seems, is kind of the shortest that you can actually have for an effective encryption key. If you go to a site that says they've got 16-bit encryption, that is woefully insufficient for today's computer age or encryption. We're going to talk about symmetric key encryption versus asymmetric key encryption a little bit. That's going to be one of the concepts you will need to know for the exam. And then key management. This is very similar to access management within a system, but the key management is talking about who has the encryption key, who has the code to unlock the encryption that actually been available. Certain personnel should have access to keys, whereas certain personnel should not, because they don't need to have access to that information that's being presented. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about what these types of encryption are. So I said we're going to talk about symmetric key encryption versus asymmetric key encryption. So the first of these, I said obviously they sound opposite because symmetric and asymmetric are contradictory. But symmetric key encryption is it's one of those things that's very fast and powerful, but very costly to implement. It's generally used by large organizations for internal communications and transmission. And I tried to make this diagram very, very large so people can see it. But basically, the original data or document is encrypted using a private key then it's sent to the secondary party, which has to use the exact same key to unencrypt it. And then that's how they transfer information. So this actually emanates with the idea that both parties have the key to encrypt. They have the exact same encryption key to utilize. The way to think about this, and there's a reason that I put a padlock on here. It wasn't just one of those random images that I throw up, which happens a lot in this course and every other course I teach. But think about a padlock. If you're going to unlock something that has a padlock, unless you just have a really good pair of bolt cutters, you need to have the exact key to utilize for that padlock. No other key will actually suit that purpose. So this would be an example of where we would have the exact identical key. And this is called a private key in both situations. We utilize a private key and another private key, which is identical. So one key utilized to unlock the transmission. Contrast that to something called asymmetric key encryption. So this is slower than symmetric, and it's not suitable for large data sets. However, it can be useful for external communications and transmission. So if we're talking about internally within a large organization, most large organizations are going to use that symmetric key encryption that we talked about. Externally, that is generally not possible because the external users are not, or external parties are not going to have access to the exact same key that our organization uses. So the way that the asymmetric key encryption works, and this is a little bit harder to conceptualize, but they encrypt it with a public key. And then each individual who wants to have access to that information has their own private key. And there are multiple private keys that are used to actually access information. No user has the same exact private key. Each individual user that's going to access the encryption has an individual key that's suitable for that purpose. So the way I think about this is there's a picture of an ATM card. Now, all users who have an ATM card can access a bank system, but they do so through a different interface. My ATM card has got a certain number, which I'm not going to tell you. All right, it's got a certain number, and that is presumably different from the ones that you have for your ATM card. Even if we have the same bank, I have US Bank as my bank. Even if we have the same bank, we can both access it through different methods. Albeit we're using the same card, or the same type of card, we're using different cards and different passcodes to access the information. So that would be an example of a public key, or sorry, a user's private key to access a public encryption. So there's additional details in this area, and we're kind of going down the rabbit hole here, but there's some important things I want to talk about because these are things that you will encounter within information security. So modern communication of privileged information, they frequently employ both asymmetric key encryption and authentication to further increase security. So they don't just rely on one set of protocols. They usually employ both. So if you're receiving an encrypted communication, not only do you have to have the key to decrypt that information, but you also have to have an authentication or some sort of authentication protocol in place, whether that be a password, whether that be an identification token, whatever it might be. That's going to be an additional layer of security. So not only are we ensuring that we have the person who's decrypting it has the encryption key, but is also the person that that is supposed to receive this communication. These methods can also incorporate additional layers of security. So there's something called hashing. Hashing utilizes an algorithm to ensure that a received file is identical in content to what was sent. So the way that hashing works is that basically an item kind of, or I won't say encrypted because that's not really a form of encryption. It's a little bit more complex than encryption, but effectively it follows the same ideas that an item is basically sent via transmission, and there's some sort of way that it gets, I won't say scrambled. I don't want to use the word encryption because it's not the same thing, but effectively encrypted. And then once it actually is descrambled, once it's actually sent to the party and they have the ability to read the file, hashing allows the secondary party to ensure that this file that was received was identical to the one that was sent. And again, it's a little bit more complex in that fact that we're not using a code, we're in fact using an algorithm, which is basically a series of mathematical statements to just verify information is correct. So similar to encryption, except it's not reversible. So encryption, basically you say, all right, I'm going to scramble it up, and then encryption says, okay, now I'm going to descramble it. Hashing is basically say, all right, we're going to create this algorithm, and you have to have the algorithm in order to be able to decode what is being sent. We can also use encryption and hashing together to create digital signatures, which I'm sure you've encountered that term before, digital signatures. It's not like doing a PDF and then saying, okay, PDF, put my name on there. Is that a digital signature? Yes, but not the type we're talking about in this situation. So here's a very brief example here. By the way, you do not need to know this example in detail. This is mostly for informational purposes. I will not test you on this unless somebody asks, will this be on the exam? Then I will absolutely test on this. Okay. So don't ask if this is going to be on the exam. All right. So basically there's going to be a certificate authority and the digital signature created through encryption and hashing. So they send the document through those lines. So you can see Alice is the authorized user and Bob's the recipient. Bob actually has to verify the certificate authority, which is basically an independent authority that validates the document that was sent by a particular user with a particular authorization. And they also have to have the hashing key to be able to decrypt the document. So the certificate authority verifies that this is the same document being sent. Hashing actually validates the document, and they actually use that digital signature to determine, is this a valid document? Is this what's supposed to be sent, or is it invalid? Is something different being sent? So that's a very simplified explanation for what is a very complex process. And I will be 100% honest. Do I understand it at a detailed level? The answer is no. I know the basics, but that's all I know, which is one big reason why I don't expect you to have the detailed understanding of this. I'm talking about a high level, so I only expect you to understand it at a high level. All right. So that's kind of the example of information security. And I know that was a lot to absorb, but one of the things that we talked about in this chapter, one of the additional topic areas that's going to be relevant is this idea of computer fraud, which I won't say is becoming increasingly prevalent because it's been prevalent for a long time. Whenever you adopt a new tool in a business, that tool is subject to certain risks. When you have computerized systems, those computerized systems are subject to degradation, or in this case, fraud, as it might be. So let's talk fraud about a very general level. So fraud is not necessarily new. It's something that's occurred for a very long time, but the concepts of fraud that are present have not necessarily been in place for that long. So I believe it was back in 1953. There was a gentleman named Dr. Donald Cressy, who was a sociologist, and he came up with his statement, which he called Cressy's hypothesis. Right at the top, see Cressy's hypothesis. So Cressy's hypothesis says, trust persons become trust violators when they conceive of themselves as having a financial problem which is non-shareable and are aware, not and aware, well, I guess and aware works. This problem can be secretly resolved by violation of the position of financial trust and are able to apply their own conduct and situation verbalizations which enable it to adjust their conceptions of themselves as trusted persons with their conceptions of themselves as users and trusted funds or property. So basically what this is saying is that these conditions are all situations that have to be met in order for trust violation to occur. And we characterize this trust violation as fraud. That's the term that we talk about it. Now, fraud can be very, very multidimensional. It's not necessarily violation of trust. Trust can actually not take place. One of the areas of fraud that's very, very well prone or very, very well publicized and prone to many organizations that operate internationally is bribery and corruption. That's not necessarily a trust violation, but the origins of that concept of fraud have roots in this trust violation. So you'll notice that I've underlined certain statements here. I want to break these down a little bit more detail because this will actually help for the understanding of what actually is present with respect to fraud. So Dr. Cressy said, having a financial problem which is non-shareable. All right, having a financial problem and non-shareable. Now, I'm actually going to use a practical example of this. It's not a financial problem, but it's something that you'll be very aware of. So let's say that you're taking the AIS course. You did very, very poorly on the first exam, and you're just like, I need an A in this course, and I'm going to graduate. All right. Is that a problem that's non-shareable? Well, you could share it with me, and I say, well, just study hard for the next exam. But you just think, Dr. Barnes explains things so badly, there is no chance that I'm going to understand the content that he gives me. So I don't know what I'm going to do. So that's non-shareable because Dr. Barnes is not helping you out in the least getting ready for this next exam. We characterize that as something being an incentive or pressure. And this is not an incentive in a good way. This is an incentive in a bad way. You've got an incentive to do something which is untoward or a pressure to actually commit an act that is problematic. So this is the first step. This is the first aspect of fraud we're talking about. The next one is this problem can be secretly resolved by the violation of position of financial trust. So there is a possibility that you could get an A on the exam, but how do you go about that? Not necessarily studying the stuff Dr. Barnes throws at you, because again, he doesn't explain things very well. But instead, you can actually violate his trust. You can say, you know what? He spends way too much time on his iPad playing games during exams. All right. So when he's got his head down, I'm going to look at some notes. I can actually violate his trust. I can say, all right, I can write down notes, and then I can notice when he's got his head down, he's not paying attention to what's going on in the class. All right. That is what we refer to as opportunity. So opportunity arises when you are put in a position where you can violate that trust without knowledge of it happening. The third one is going to be a big, long statement. They are able to apply their own conduct in situation verbalizations, which enable them to adjust conceptions themselves as trusted persons, which is a mouthful. But think about this in context. Let's say that these first two situations exist, but you are the most honest person on this entire planet. You would never step on the grass if the sign says keep off the grass, all right? Even if you really thought there's no harm in doing so, you will follow the rules in every situation. It honestly does not matter what the other statements are, the other situations are. If you are honest and you are fully ethical, you're never going to violate that. The only way the situation can occur is you have to say, all right, I'm going to apply a conduct which situation verbalization is enabled to adjust your conceptions. In another way is saying, I'm going to justify doing something that I know I shouldn't be doing. Dr. Barnes is a terrible instructor. He constantly berates us. He makes us drink Red Bull, stuff like that, okay? You know, all these things that Dr. Barnes is terrible about, you're justifying, like, if he wasn't such a horrible instructor, I would have a better grade in this class, all right? So you are trying to actually develop an attitude or rationalization for your actions. The idea behind this is similar to the CIA triad, is that these conditions have to, remember the CIA triad said these conditions have to exist for security to be paramount. The opposite is true here. What we're looking at here is something called the fraud triangle. These three conditions have to exist in order for fraud to occur. So again, center of pressure, you actually identify or you have a problem that you think is non-shareable. It's not something that you can fix without taking extreme action. Opportunity, you identify that there is some area that where you can actually violate trust to your own benefit. And then attitude, you can justify those actions. So attitude or rationalization, you can justify those actions. Again, all three of these have to be present in order for it to occur. If you have no pressure, there's no reason for you to cheat. If you have no opportunity, then there's no chance for you to cheat. If you have no justification, there's no way you're going to do it because you're just too honest. So all three have to be present, and that's true for cheating, and it's true for fraud in the real world as well. This is one of those areas that students find fascinating, and when I ask questions about this, usually there's a high pass rate on the exams because it's like, okay, I can relate to this. I can relate to this. Hopefully you can't relate to this because you were cheating on previous exams, but you can relate to this because the philosophy is so profound and so interesting. So let's go into a little bit more detail about what computer fraud represents within most organizations. So oftentimes when we talk about fraud within the context of accounting and business, we think about it on a couple of different dimensions. We usually think about it not only just on theft or misappropriation of assets, but we think about financial misstatements. So like you heard the terms Enron and WorldCom. I know you have because I actually talked about them in this course. Those were financial statement frauds, which not to say they're not relevant, but most financial statement frauds tend to operate through personnel manipulation or people actually making manipulations to information, whereas misappropriation of assets is increasingly becoming more common at the computer level. So you will notice that these examples that we're going to talk about here tend to focus on theft or misappropriation of assets. So the first one, theft, is going to be a theft of computer readable records or files by altering computer readable records or files. And then the second one is very closely related, theft or by altering the logic of computer software. Has anybody ever heard of the movie Office Space? Okay, so it's an old movie. It's like from 1999, but it actually uses kind of the same context. Basically, the programmers in there went in and they manipulated the financial reporting of the payroll process to where the rounding for what they're supposed to be, rounding to the nearest cent, would take that extra cent and would put that into a separate bank account, which actually is an old scheme from an older movie, Superman, I think Superman 3, back in the 1980s. Regardless of where the origin was, is that the idea being is they're altering the logic of computer software to actually reroute the assets to themselves into a separate bank account. So that was kind of a theft, an example of that. So theft of computer readable information, that's actually going to be one that we've already talked about when people are trying to access systems that shouldn't have access to it. Theft or intentional destruction of computer software. So this is going to be corruption of systems, trying to actually access the systems to either shut them down or make them accessible or steal them for their own use. And then finally, theft of computer hardware. So both of those are assets of the organization. One is going to be a virtual asset, the other one's going to be a tangible asset, but they're both necessary for computer functioning. So what are some ways that we can go about trying to prevent fraud or trying to address fraud in an organization? Well, the first one is obvious. We want to prevent fraud from ever occurring. And this is going to be this category of preventive controls that we've already talked about in this course. But we want to prevent fraud from occurring in this organization. So some of the broad areas that we can actually address in this is, first of all, fraud risk assessment should be performed by management. Management should understand what are the areas that a organization is susceptible to with respect to fraud, and there need to be protocols to address those particular risks. We're very familiar with that because we talked about responses to risk in the previous chapter. Those are going to be controls. Now, controls are not wholeheartedly effective against fraud, but they do a good job of preventing fraud from occurring. We also want to make sure that the governance mechanism of the organization, which is usually going to be the audit committee or the board of directors, provides oversight of internal and external auditors. Internal auditors tend to focus on the operations of the organization, whereas external auditors focus on reporting of an organization. Both of those are very relevant with respect to fraud because they cover different aspects of fraud that can occur within the organization. I would say largely this is going to be internal auditor focused because we're more concerned about theft and misappropriation of assets, but both internal and external auditors are going to be relevant in this regard. Probably the most important one, and so something that Joe talked about a little bit earlier, is communication and training of employees to make them aware of their responsibilities. Now, this seems like so obvious and so apparent, but it is so difficult in practicality for this to work. Like we said, the weakest part of any computerized system is going to be the employees who actually use that system or the people who utilize that system. And oftentimes that's because people do not understand the purpose of particular activities or actions within the system. Why do you not write down your password on a Post-it note? It's so inconvenient to try to remember it. Well, if you have it written down on a Post-it note, anybody has access to it and they can access the system. Why do you change your password? Why do you have to use these dynamic passwords that have like character, non-character, non-numeric, non-alphabetic characters? Or why do we have to use large or lowercase? Why does it have to be a dynamic password, which doesn't sound like your name? Why are all those present? It's because when you don't have those aspects, it becomes easier to hack into the password. There are algorithm systems now that can hack passwords in a matter of, well, I'm going to say a matter of seconds. It's less than seconds. So you've got a 4-character password that's only single characters, no capitalization. It literally takes less than time than I can actually say a single word to hack that for some of these complex systems. So that would be an example of that. By and large, this goes much broader than that. We talk about controls within an organization. Remember that segregation of duties control we talked about? If people don't understand the purpose of segregation of duties, they're not likely to follow those rules, and that can be problematic. If you give access to somebody says, well, I can't actually do that. I don't have the time right now, but here's my password. You can go and access the system and record this entry book yourself. That sounds like so ridiculous in the context of this course, but that happens all the time in the real world. That's something that we see consistently is violations of these controls that are meant to keep the computerized systems more secure. So these are preventive controls. We definitely have detective controls, but we're going to jump forward and we're going to talk a little bit about what are some ways, we're going to talk a little bit more about the fraud detection. So even though we would like to have these controls in place that actually prevent fraud from ever occurring, it does take place. There's just not any way to stop it, simply because the controls are not all encompassing. They can't actually stop everything. So we want to make sure we have fraud detection mechanisms in place as well. Certainly want to make sure business process evaluation occurs by internal auditors. We want to make sure that they understand what is happening in the organization, what controls are currently in place, and are people following those controls? Are they using dynamic passwords? Are they using multi-factor authentication? The answer is no. Ask the question, why not? It's like, well, multi-factor authentication is such a pain. I have to take out my phone and I have to go to this program, this app on my phone, then I have to type in a code, and I just rather not, you know. So yeah, I relate. Okay, sometimes it can be a little bit tedious, but it's very, very critical to prevent computer problems. We want to make sure there's transaction analysis laid over the data to determine the effectiveness of those controls and any indicators of fraudulent activity. If you can go in and identify things at a very, very basic level, if you can perform some basic data analysis, and you notice a person who's been with the organization for a little while and they're getting paid $12 an hour, but they have paychecks of $4,000 a week, you might say, the math does not check out there. You might say, why is this person being paid $4,000 a week when they're making $12 an hour? I'd feel bad because $12 an hour is not a very high pay rate, but I would also say $4,000 just mathematically does not make sense. I'll be honest, I haven't done the calculation of the number of hours they'd have to work a week, but it'd be a lot, probably more than are available in a single week. And then continuous monitoring of transaction activity. We actually talked about this back in blockchain with continuous monitoring. If we only look at a certain point in time, then we may not actually be able to pick up on an issue, particularly if the people are committing fraud know that there's going to be periodic monitoring. By having continuous monitoring, continuous review of the processes, it actually enables us to see if anything occurs at a point in time or occurs fairly regularly and consistently. Last topic I want to talk about is a little bit less important and prominent than others, but still very, very relevant. It has to do with this idea of system availability. We would like to ensure that the computerized systems that we operate on are going to be available when we need them. And in some ways, that's just making sure we have good resources in place. But as we know, the unexpected can occur. So what can we do? What can organizations do to ensure that systems are consistently available, even in times of problems? Well, for preventative measures, we want to make sure that we actually have a few items in place, a few mechanisms in place. The first one to be obvious is uninterruptible power supply. If the power goes down due to whatever reason, then there's going to be a backup, maybe that be a generator or battery that will allow the computer running until we can safely shut down and back up the information that we need. Then we have this thing called fault tolerance, which sounds really, really complicated. Basically, all that means is if a program or a hardware item in the computer stops running, that the computer can recognize and acknowledge and basically take the appropriate steps to keep the computer from crashing. This was really problematic back in the 1980s when the computers were first starting. If a program shut down, then the entire system would shut down. So fault tolerance is one of those protocols to say, if we have a piece of software that's running, even if it's a critical piece of software for the system, we don't want the system to stop running. We want to actually be able to make sure the computer system keeps operating, even if that piece of software or that piece of hardware is not available. The other one that you probably are more familiar with has to do with backup, and it has to do with the idea of virtualization or cloud computing. Having a computerized system on the back end of an organization with a backup is very good. So for the virtual system at Truman State, there's probably a computer out there that's solely dedicated to backup. That being said, it is still part of the computer system here at Truman State University. So they would want to have a virtual backup available as well. Or one of the more relevant ones, one of the more recent ones, is this idea of cloud computing. So cloud computing allows us to store information on an off-site location. Usually, I think we're currently using both OneDrive and Google Drive, both examples of that. So if our system gets attacked and shut down, which I don't know that will ever happen, but if our system gets shut down, then we still have access to certain information offsite. If you remember, a lot of the information that occurred during the Truman State attack, if you had it on the computer drive at Truman State, they had their last backup on their system 2 weeks prior. So if you put something in between that period between the backup and the time that Truman State was attacked, then if you were on the computer system, like the Y drive or the U drive, or I think those are drives that the students use, the Y or those drives, then you probably lost that information. But if it was on Google Drive or Microsoft OneDrive, those were separate systems. Those were on the cloud, so you were able to access that. And then we have these corrective controls, disaster recovery planning and business continuity management. Now, it's important to note that both of these concepts relate to disaster planning. So in the case of like an attack, a cyber attack, or whether this be a natural disaster, these both encompass how a company or organization is going to respond to these disasters. But this is going to be during or after the disaster takes place. Disaster recovery planning is basically focused on restoring IT, or information technology, and data access, whereas business continuity planning is keeping the business operational during and after the incident, during and after the disaster. So one is saying, all right, our system is down, we need to get back up and running. That's disaster recovery planning. The business continuity planning is saying, okay, we don't have a system, but we've got to keep the business, we got to keep the organization up and going during this time. I will say that I've been time at Truman State, I've been part of two kind of disasters, quote unquote, at Truman State University. One, everybody in this room should be familiar with. That was the ransomware attack back in April of 2023. If you go back further, I don't think anybody in this room was part of that, but that was the pandemic when we actually had the shutdown there. Truman State was exceptionally good with respect to the disaster recovery planning. They actually responded and made good progress within a short period of time at addressing both of those issues. Their business continuity management was problematic, and that had a lot to do with the fact that people were encountering issues they had never encountered before. If you were here during the pandemic, you had varying degrees of success with your instructors. Some instructors went immediately online and taught really well. I did that. And then, some instructors were kind of like, I don't understand computers. Semester's over. Okay, yeah. So, or basically saying, okay, you need to read all this, and then we'll have an exam on it. And so that was kind of the example that Regardless, these are both concepts and organization we have to keep in mind. All right, homework on Wednesday. Please complete it. Be ready to talk. I'll see you guys then.